around the
Recording
country.
in progress.
But it's clear that the major assault will be on the east. Most likely, they will try to encircle our units, which are currently in the east near Kramatorsk, Slavyansk. Specifically, which direction, which route they will take for this. We actually have several options, and we're getting ready for all of them. This time, the authorities decided to be, more kind of, how to say this, even mindful of the civilians, and so there is they actually demand some civilians who are not involved in supporting critical infrastructure to leave major cities. That applies to Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk. So I think this is, we also learned from what happened in the first wave of aggression. So we need to get civilians, to safety as early as possible. So that's where we are. Obviously, the most fierce fighting is now near Mariupol, near Kharkiv, historically, and also in Kherson area. What helps now and what is the arms supply to Ukraine. Specifically, I think the supply of anti-ship missiles, Harpoon. It's almost a game changer now in Odessa region. So I spoke today with my colleagues there, and obviously there's only one reaction there. I wish we had them earlier. That could have saved a lot of lives.
So you're saying you now have the anti-ship missiles?
Yeah.
No, that's very good news. That's very good news. Okay, General Dayton, you've had extensive experience with the Ukrainian military. I would appreciate too your take on the military situation in Ukraine.
Well, I would be foolish not to agree with Alexander because he's there. He sees it very close up. What I would tell you, though, John, is that the Russians still have tremendous advantages. They have advantages in numbers. They have the initiative, whether we like it or not. Their biggest advantage is in long-range rocket artillery and missiles, which are very hard to defeat. And they can shoot these from within the Russian territory. They have air superiority, and they have information dominance at home. So the home side is pretty well covered, I would think, and I'd be very glad to hear what Vladimir has to say about it. The other thing I would say is when we were working, and I was the defense advisor, Alexander, you may not remember, but I met you with the Defense Reform Advisory Board back.
Of course I do remember. Of course I do remember.
We were really focused on two things, and that was NATO principles and standards and trying to reorganize the higher levels. But in the other areas, we were focused not on large military operations, but on small unit tactics. That's what was being taught at Yavoriv. Now, it turns out that was actually smarter than we realized, because it's small unit tactics that the Ukrainians are using to great effect against the rather cumbersome and slow to react Russian forces. What do I think they're doing? I think they're doing exactly what Alexander says. I think they're trying to basically conquer what they call Novorossiya, all the way out to Odessa. I'm very glad to hear about the Harpoons as well, because that could be decisive along the Black Sea coast. But nevertheless, I think they've decided that the east and the south is where they're going to focus their activity. And this could get very ugly very fast. And I'll leave it at there.
Okay, thank you. Before I go to Mr. Milov, Alexander, I just want to come back to you for a second. I've been hearing for 3 weeks that quote unquote Mariupol is going to fall. Why has that not happened? Or put another way, how has Ukraine managed to keep the city?
Well, we have a very motivated units that defend the city, and they actually move to the a favorable condition location for defending them. It's Azovstal. So I'm speaking about Azov now, highly motivated. And they've been, one thing that I want to say is that they've been preparing for this battle since 2014-15, right? They're very committed. when they heard from the political establishment that nothing is happening, there will be no war, they actually were preparing every day for this. And so that explains why they still holding positions. But as you understand that, sadly, strategically, taking Mariupol is not that important anymore for Russia, because they pretty much secured their corridor already. So it's basically symbolic. You want to crush the defenders. They would love them to be, take them prisoners. But as I said, very well trained, very strongly motivated soldiers, and they will not give in.
Okay, thank you. It's too bad they didn't have the anti-ship missiles a couple of months ago. All right, Vlad, what was Russia's original plan in the invasion on February 24? And now the Russian military is saying the real aims of the campaign are in the East. What do you make of all this?
First, I think it's clear to mostly everybody now that Putin counted on a blitzkrieg. He wanted to overwhelm Ukrainian military in just a few days, and there was no plan B beyond that. I have to say, with all these discussions that we had in the previous months about whether Putin will invade Ukraine this time or not, I think most important issue, which was underestimated by military analysts, now they operated in terms of quantity, numbers of troops, numbers of heavy weaponry, planes, tanks, ships, and so on. But I always pointed out, and I think, Ambassador, you probably remember our discussions on that, one factor which was underestimated is extremely low quality of Russian troops who are underfinanced, under-equipped, poorly trained, and I think that's a game changer, which have led us to eventual victories of Ukraine in the past month and a half, is that there is an abyss in terms of motivation of troops to fight on the Ukrainian side on one hand, and on the Russian side. The motivation is extremely low. Morale of troops is extremely low. I think the massacres and the mass killings of civilians and war crimes that we are seeing is basically a flip side of that. That's a sort of revenge on a peaceful population for inability of Russian troops to actually fight. I think what Putin is doing now, he's bitterly wounded by the failure of his initial plan. He wants to at least capture something to bring to the Russian people as a sort of achievement in this military operation, which is why I think, yes, it's a conventional wisdom that he would launch an attack on Donbass, taking the remaining territory of Luhansk and Donetsk regions, which are not under Russian control. But it might be broader than that, including Kharkov, including some of the regions of the south of Ukraine, with the goal of sort of establishing a North Korea, East Germany type of puppet government, the alternative anti-Ukraine under Russian control. I think what is important to understand in this regard is that the troops that he's assembling and also the hardware that he's assembling for a new offensive in Donbass and beyond, these are of even a worse quality than he had initially preparing for the invasion of February 24th. So he's kind of desperate in this attempt. I think we should look more into that. And I think if only Ukraine is a bit better armed and better equipped, Putin can suffer a decisive defeat in his new offensive in Donbass. I think this is what we should be aiming at. Because if he's not defeated, if he manages to sort of get out with some territorial gains and some sort of a lasting ceasefire, he will use this time to regroup, refresh his forces, resupply, and try again. I think that's pretty clear from the past 8 years that any sort of ceasefire will only be used for Putin to buy time to try again. And another issue which I think will be coming out in this debate is the Russian public opinion. We'll be happy to tell you more on that. But this is complicated on many issues, and definitely there's absolutely nothing like 70-80% support for the war, which has been mentioned by the media to begin with. like the same Levada poll, which says 81% of Russians approve Putin's special operation, there is another figure in that same poll, which I think is not fair to quote the first figure without the second one, which says only 29 people pay close attention to what is, 29% are paying close attention to what is happening. I think it's important for the Westerners to realize what kind of a disinformation and censorship bubble Russians are living in. Many sincerely have no idea what is going on. So that's a complicated topic. There's still a significant support for the war, but also significant opposition, and many people are really confused. We need to get beyond just catchy headlines on that matter. Thank you.
You mentioned that the troops who Putin will now send will not be as high of quality as those who've already been sent. We hosted Mikhail Khodorkovsky 2 days ago, and he said that the Russian troops have coming from both the Northern Caucasus and he said like villages, low density population areas. But if Putin needs to put another 200,000 troops into Ukraine, he's going to have to pull conscript people in the major cities, which could be a political liability for him. What do you think about that analysis?
Well, I think one thing is very clear. The information that I'm getting across Russia is that are heavily involved in recruiting contract fighters, offering them a salary of 200,000 rubles per month or something beyond that, just something in the range of $2,000 per month in the under current exchange rate. Most regions in Russia, obviously, save the capitals. Most other regions are extremely poor. So that's a hell of a salary for the people who live there and have no job, no economic prospect. I think many would come voluntarily, Caucasus or other parts of Russia. However, it is also very clear that their combat ability would be extremely low. There is no time for training, and obviously these troops will have absolutely poor understanding, poor coordination, and so on. So again, my best advice is just to look beyond numbers. Putin probably will be able to get some additional numbers of troops, but as we saw in the past 6 weeks, numbers is not the only fact that matter. The low quality of their troops might lead to significant Ukrainian victories if we just do not scare ourselves, but realize what the actual quality of these new troops really is.
Thank you. Okay. Ms. Getmenchuk, so far we focused on the war. Let's talk about the diplomacy now. In the negotiations taking place in Turkey, both sides have offered compromises, and the Russian side has even appeared to concede that Ukraine could join the European Union. But Putin has in no sense endorsed the talks, and his own statement suggests that he has not given up his maximalist aims, which Vlad just sort of endorsed that notion. How do you assess the negotiations? Do they hold any real significance?
Thank you, Ambassador Herbst, for the invitation and for your question. But before answering the question, I would like to underline that actually by its heroic, I would say, resistance, Ukraine forced Russia to conduct talks about Ukraine's future directly with Ukraine.
Correct.
As we all remember, even 3 months ago, Putin saw the deal on Ukraine exclusively as part of broader deal or as a part of his Russia-US deal mainly. So without Ukraine even being at the table. So we actually, I think that's our first achievement, that we actually forced Russia to make Ukraine a part of negotiation process on Ukraine's future. And even though I'm not a fan of negotiations, of any negotiations with Putin without any de-escalation from his side, but I also think that Ukraine did a good job by proving once again that it's very serious about diplomacy. Ukraine did its part of the deal by developing its diplomatic proposals and passing them to Russian side. And second, Ukraine proved once again that for saving more people's lives, it is ready to compromise. And this is Ukraine's response to those voices and to those people in many countries, especially European countries, who are accusing Ukraine in not willing to compromise for the sake of peace, potential peace. I think that Ukraine's actually readiness to give up on NATO's membership aspirations and turn Ukraine into a neutral state, the idea I personally don't support, but Ukraine's readiness to do that is actually is even not a compromise. I would say that it's rather like a painful concession. Because let's agree that it's not easy for a politician in Ukraine to refuse from NATO membership aspiration when 70%, it was even more like a couple of weeks ago, of Ukrainians support Ukraine's membership in alliance. And this is despite even huge disappointments in NATO's reaction on the current war, which is well known. We shouldn't forget when we are talking about negotiations that at that point we are talking only about Ukraine's proposals. We are not talking about agreement which is accepted by Putin. And the only visible response Putin provided for those proposals so far is a major new offensive in eastern Ukraine. That's all. And even if Putin eventually, after maybe not very successful military campaign, accepts the deal, is far from clear that he would deliver on his part of agreement, because there is no any significant agreement with Ukraine that Russia hasn't violated. At least I cannot name such an agreement. Moreover, every signed previous agreements, and Minsk deal is one of the recent examples, Russians perceive as Ukraine's to-do list, not something Russia has to deliver on as well. That's why I think that ongoing negotiations should not distract Ukraine and its partners in the West, including the United States, from the most crucial task at the moment, which Alexander already mentioned, is weapon supply to Ukraine. Those weapons and in those amounts that are really needed by Ukraine, not those that our partners consider useful or having in excess or something like that. So, and the real negotiations, in my view, are being held at the battlefield now. So, and we should be ready that diplomatic negotiations can lead to nowhere. War crimes we witnessed recently in Bucha and other places are only narrowing down the room for maneuver within the negotiation process. So that's why it's important to focus on weapon supply in this moment, not on negotiations. And one more thing, you mentioned in your question that the Russians have even appeared to concede that Ukraine could join the EU. I'm more pessimistic on that. We all remember association agreement story. And there was also recently an article published at Kremlin website. It was published in Russian state media, but republished even on Kremlin website, a sort of political manifesto written by a well-known, even in Ukraine, spin doctor, or because I cannot name him a political analyst, so it's like he's a spin doctor. And in that article, actually, the name of the article was named "What Russia Should Do with Ukraine," and he was arguing that they should deal with denazification in Ukraine, because it turned out that not only Ukrainian political leadership, but all Ukrainians are infected by this Nazi ideology. And one of the idea was that I'm quoting here that Ukraine denazification means its inevitable de-Europeanization. And I think that's another evidence that they are against any processes which would bring Ukraine closer to the European Union.
Thank you. Actually, I'll just make one comment. I agree with you. And I would say it's clear that Putin himself and people around him have not in any way suggested that those talks, the diplomatic talks, have any significance.
Absolutely.
It's like they could be happening in a bubble. And actually,
Yep.
I'm glad, if you want to comment on that, I'd welcome it.
Well, so there's several things. First, on the articles that you read from various sorts of Russian imperialists, I think that nothing of that is new. There's been going on with this imperialist crap for years. I think people are simply wondering at the extent of cynicism that you might read in this new publications. But to me, this is also the flip side of desperation that they find themselves in right now, because they completely underestimated Ukrainian will to resist. They overestimated their own capabilities on all fronts. They underestimated Western unity and Western sanctions. So I think you see that many atrocities and a lot of this neo-Nazi language that is coming out of the Kremlins now, that's a reflection of that. Again, I would come back to the story of the Russian public opinion. One thing which is very important right now is dynamics. There is no such thing as like an increase of support of what Putin is doing over time. People are clearly changing their minds after they learn what is going on. We track that with many tools that we have and with the efforts of independent pollsters that are still remaining. So basically, after Putin dropped his information bomb on the Russians with the beginning of this war, now many people actually begin to look around and realize what's really going on. It's also important not to double down and not to blink on the continuing Western sanctions. Because as soon as people realize the extent on which Russia is really dependent on the rest of the world economically, financially, technology-wise, logistics-wise, then, you know, this whole story of a great Russia which can dictate its will to the rest of the world that is promoted by the Russian television collapses. The one thing, you know, one question which Russians, many of whom even support Putin and say that they support the war, the one uncomfortable question which they keep asking themselves right now: why in this past quarter of a century, when we are supposedly, you know, raised from our knees, why we can't produce anything by ourselves? Why we are so dependent on like everything across the board, across the supply chain? That is a very strong, you know, difference from the TV reality that propaganda is portraying. We need to double down on efforts actually illustrating that difference so that people begin waking up.
Okay, thank you. All right. Alexander, you kind of anticipated a little bit the question I'm going to ask you now, but I think it is so important. I'll give you a chance to take it on again. What should the United States and the West be doing to make sure Ukraine can stop the Russians with their next offensive and actually win this war?
You know, first, obviously, I wanted to comment on previous speakers, but I will not do this.
Okay.
Because answering this question is much more important, just to continue like a smooth kind of continuation of previous points.
I agree with you.
What we need from US? Well, first of all, with the soft, right? So continue with the sanctions. But my position was always that sanctions will not stop the war. So the key thing that we need from United States and from NATO alliance is arms. Weapons, and specifically what is happening at the moment is that Russian forces been destroying our artillery, our multiple rocket launch systems, aircraft, air defense systems. What we have, they actually were targeting it and destroying it little by little, right? Also, we're running out of ammunition. So that is a very, very serious risk for us. So we clearly need long-range artillery. We need ammunition. We need multiple rocket launch systems. We need air defense. We need anti-ship missiles. So, and we will need some armed vehicles as well. And we need them now. That's a key point. We need them now. And what I see is that over the last couple of days, I see the dynamics change. I see that Britain is supplying us finally something which we ask them to do, and they actually show example to other countries. So basically situation is changing. But I would like to raise another point, is that what we're getting, besides harpoons, for example, right? But we're mainly getting the old Soviet equipment, something that Russians have. And the main logic is this is what Ukrainians can know how to use. But we also need to look forward and understand that this war is going to last. And if we just kind of accept this, then we will look at the situation from a totally different angle. We should not rely on equipment, which eventually will run out, right? And we will be running like to Poland or Slovakia, which other countries may have it. No, we need to get access to the equipment that could be supplied in unlimited quantities. And this is the Western-made equipment. And that applies to artillery. It's not that difficult for Ukrainians to learn it. Absolutely, right? Same applies to drones, same applies to aviation. So that's what we need. I think that strategic shift needs to happen. That's pretty much what I would like to say. And that could change the tide. Now, if you don't mind, I will just briefly now address a couple of points. It's just, let's just talk about the time. Time is actually playing against Putin. On one hand, obviously, he can use it to regroup, to increase the combat capacity of his troops. But on the other hand, he's under time pressure to show some results. A. B. We also actually preparing to defend our position. We use the time quite effectively to protect the country and the key position. And then the third, coming back to weapons. If weapon supply will continue, basically, if we get what I just mentioned, if we start getting it, that the time would be playing against Putin, because we would be actually armed not to change the tide in this war. If this kind of period of relative silence, right, will be considered as, okay, let's see, maybe Putin will change their tactic, and let's don't irritate him with more weapon supply. Well, the time from this, if that's going to happen, that the time will work against us. So I think I encourage to all our partners to actually supply weapons. And one point, just to finalize on the poor quality of troops of Russians. Well, it's always good to underestimate the enemy. They're poor, but they had quite strong fighting units actually. The descent was quite strong. So they have quite strong army. We should admit this, but they just miscalculated the strategy. And if they learn from this, we can have a hard time. They made a mistake. And as General Dayton said, is that what turned out on our side, the strategy, what we're getting, we were helped to develop with NATO support, right? Actually, it worked. So Russians actually can learn now, and next wave, they could be more effective. We need to be just sober about this. And why? Is because Putin cannot afford to lose second time. For him, it will be a total defeat from my point of view. If he loses on his next wave, right? That for me, I believe, would mean almost equal change of regime in Moscow. That's my view.
Thank you. General Dayton, I'd also like, you had senior national security positions. You know this area well. If you were advising President Biden, what would you tell him? And what do you think of Alexander's idea that we need to start sending weapons, which are not simply Soviet weapons, but our own Western weapons for a long war?
To answer your first part first, John, I think that was what was behind the MiG deal not going through. Although it took a lot of criticism, the MiGs are very much outdated aircraft. They would be easy targets, and there is no logistical tail that goes with them. That would be a real problem. And in some ways, they'd be a burden to Ukraine. I heard talk about possibly F-16s, much better solution. Look, two things I wanted to make earlier. The first thing that Minister Zagorodnyuk did was he started a territorial defense concept for Ukraine. At the time, I thought this was crazy. It turns out to be very smart. It turns out that that's what the Ukrainians are executing right now. Secondly, Ukrainian special forces are probably the equal, if not better, than Russian special forces. That's an area where we put an awful lot of emphasis over the last few years, and that's working. So conventional wisdom is this war will end when Putin says it ends. That's kind of the video game mentality. We're all just kind of watching and waiting to see what the operator behind the console is doing. I think that's foolish, and I think we certainly can influence this action. And you ask what I would say to the president. I would tell him that this has now acquired a momentum of its own. Things have changed qualitatively in the last week. Not only the war crimes that are very obvious and the tragedy that's taking place in Ukraine, but even speeches coming out of the Kremlin, to include Medvedev's latest speech. The Ukrainians now, I think, are in a stronger position morally than they've ever been. Having said that, we need to figure out what we want to do. We don't have a strategy. And by we, I mean the US, NATO, and the EU. Do we want to just restore the status quo prior, a stalemate like we had 6 months ago? Or do we want Ukraine to win this and liberate its occupied territories now, and thereby potentially defeating the Russian army? I realize some people will say that's crazy. You can't talk like that. There's weapons of mass destruction looming on the horizon. Well, guess what? They're looming there right now anyway. And if we continue to let ourselves be intimidated by that threat, then we are simply back watching a video game. If we want to restore the status quo prior, then the level of assistance we're doing now, javelins, stingers, things like that, are probably okay, but there's a real danger that Russia will take over the south and the east. Or if we want B, we really need to control the air. And that means both sophisticated air defense, it means aircraft, it means all kinds of stuff. And we've got to make a decision here, whether or not we're serious about what we're talking about. Sanctions are not going to do it. I agree with Alexander here. Sanctions are important, but Putin's done a pretty good job of blunting the sanctions so far, selling his oil to the Chinese, to the Indians, and, oh, by the way, still selling it to the Europeans, who really can't make up their mind. So the last thing I would suggest to the president is what you need to do is give the Ukrainians the weapons they need to win. That's part one. And part two, I would encourage him very strongly to call a summit, potentially in Kyiv, of the European Union countries, plus the United States, Canada, and Ukraine, to decide what the hell we want Europe to look like 5 years from now, and whether or not Russia can ever be a player again, or whether they've forfeited that opportunity for a very long time. Thank you.
Keith, I think with that last comment about the summit in Kyiv, you've just given the headline to this event. Very, very innovative. I like it a lot.
Why don't we do it in Yalta?
Okay. All right, Vlad, over to you. Do you think Putin can accept a peace settlement that limits him to the status quo prior to this new invasion? Any insights also on the legitimate threats to Putin's regime if things go badly? Russian public opinion, well, you've already commented on that. And Putin's inner circle is highly dependent on him personally for their authority. Does he survive?
First, I think he will try to make some more gains. Right now, with the territorial gains that were already made, are insufficient for Putin to accept any sort of a ceasefire. He will try to get more control over some vital parts of Ukrainian territory, including the rest of Donbass, including probably Kharkov. I don't know, whatever he is able to capture in the east and the south. But again, now that's a very clear warning, and many people, I think, understand that. Any illusions that this peace treaty that he might get into theoretically will last, these illusions are a mistake. This is a miscalculation. he will only guarantees. I mean, I can show you. I have a video of him speaking 20 years ago at the Rome summit with NATO, exactly at the time when a major wave of NATO enlargement has happened. He never said a single word that there is a threat, right? He actually was praising the cooperation with NATO at the time. We have 15 countries of the former Soviet bloc actually becoming members of NATO. Not in a single country of those any sort of missiles were placed to threaten Russia over a quarter of a century, right? So this is all. Their talk about security guarantees is just like, I mean, it's a fake narrative helping them to buy time, which means any value of any potentially signed peaceful agreement will be next to zero to me. So I strongly warn you to not to buy any sort of Putin's commitments. Now, the second thing, many people are actually, trying to have this hopeful look into Putin's inner circle, whether they will overthrow him. Just as a hint, I recently made a specific video on that matter. As a former bureaucrat, I know a thing or two about how things work there in the Kremlin, explaining whether a potential coup d'etat is possible. To me, it's not. The actual likelihood is also close to zero, because Putin specifically built a lot of checks and barriers over time, divisions between various military and security agencies and so on, many other impediments as well, total surveillance by FSB over officials. They're literally afraid of talking to each other, criticizing Putin, because they think that most likely there will be audio taped and this will be reported, right? So that's the likelihood of this is not very large, to say the least. And I wanted to come back to a couple of issues that were raised in the discussions. Yes, it's right. We should not underestimate Russian military as well. But we should, what was happening before the war began. And I think this played a major part in Western decisions not to provide significant military assistance to Ukraine. Because many Western military analysts overestimated the superiority of Russian military. We heard reports about 96 hours and Kyiv will fall and stuff like that, right? So this overestimation actually led to decisions not to support Ukraine militarily. I think we should not repeat that mistake. I think we should be very clear that while there is a risk, while Russians still can regroup, there is also an opportunity, because they will simply not have enough time to train the new troops that are being amassed now close to Donbass. There is a very good prospect of potentially delivering a military defeat to Putin. And this is vital. I completely agree that military aid is now more important than anything. But I want to conclude by saying that also it's all of the above. It's not just, we shouldn't pick, what is it, sanctions, military supplies. It's all of the above. We should double down on sanctions. We should provide Ukraine with needed military assistance. We should double down on efforts to counter-offend against Putin's propaganda inside Russia to change the minds of ordinary Russians. So we need to try all of the options to actually not only stop Putin, but reverse the course of events, make him retreat, make Russian elite rethink what was going on, and actually move towards more strategic long-term goal of long-term pacification of Russia, not just stopping Putin from actual combat at the moment.
Thank you. Alyona, my question for you is about the negotiations, but feel free to comment on anyone's previous remarks. So Zelensky has said that any peace settlement with Russia, especially the compromises, must be approved by a referendum of the entire Ukrainian people. What does this mean about the prospects for compromises on neutrality, the status of the LNR and the DNR, and Crimea?
I would actually briefly react on what previous speaker,
Please,
Mr. Klov, said.
I invite you to do that.
Yeah, if possible, in order to follow up,
okay,
and then come back to your question. Actually, I would say that there is no illusion in Ukraine that any agreement reached with Putin today, possibly agreement, because it's not the fact that it would be reached, would last for a long time, or I don't know, would be sustainable, let's say this way. So we perfectly understand that even the best agreement at this point could not reflect Putin's maximalist agenda on Ukraine, and therefore would not prevent Putin from further comebacks. Even President Zelensky, I think 2 days ago, he said that in his recent interviews that even the best agreement it could be a situation even when Putin could come back like in 2 years, even when we reach agreement now, and it would be good agreement both for Ukraine and Russia, or more or less good, in current situation. So there is an understanding that he will come back, And what I would underline here, that we should keep in mind that every Putin's comeback to Ukraine is much more brutal, much more cynical, and much more bloody than previous one. We remember that he annexed Crimea without a single shot, and they told a lot about that. They boasted that they did manage to do that peacefully. Then there was more bloody Donbass, much more bloody Donbass campaign, and finally, totally like barbaric, accompanied with endless war crimes, attack we are witnessing now. So we can only guess how his next comeback could look like, On referendum, I think that it was a good idea to include a referendum as a part of Ukraine's peace proposal, even though in the past I was pretty much convinced that major national security decisions should be adopted by political leadership, not by Ukrainian public. But now I think it's a good idea, and the referendum idea itself, I think, is a strong signal that Ukraine is a democracy, and no major decision taken by Ukrainian president, even by President Zelensky, who is now enjoying unprecedented, around 90% of public support, would be credible, sustainable, and accepted by society. I also think that Zelensky, by including this referendum idea in Ukraine's peace plan, made it clear to Russians that if you want us to convince Ukrainian society to accept the offer, we need a really good offer for Ukraine, not a capitulation agreement, but something that we can sell Ukrainians, something that Ukrainian people can accept. So that's a challenge. That's a real challenge, and I think that the problem here is that to some extent Ukrainian authorities fell a victim of their own narrative that Ukraine is winning this war. That's why news about Ukraine's readiness to make compromise on NATO membership were met in Ukrainian societies at least with raised eyebrows. Like, why are we offering concessions if we are so successful at the battlefield? And I personally heard these questions many, many times during recent weeks. And maybe that was the reason why official voices recently started to present a more realistic picture on what is going on the ground. Because that picture they presented at the beginning about Ukraine's successful resistance and even Ukraine's successful attacks didn't match the proposal they made diplomatically. I think it's important. And Mr. Milov said that many people overestimated Russian army, and now you know, we are witnessing and we are facing a problem when many people recently overestimated probably Ukraine's ability to resist, Ukraine's army ability to resist. And that's why it's not easy, you know, to communicate that we need much more arms. We need it urgently, because people say, and I personally spoke to many people in the US, in some EU member states, and they said, oh, but the situation is quite good. You are like winning, you are attacking, you have probably have everything what you need to defend yourself, and even to, you know, attack at some the dimensions and directions. So that's why it's, you know, we should be quite realistic about current situation. And on your question about status, referendum and DPR, so-called DPR, LPR status, Crimea status, I don't think that those issues would be submitted to referendum. I think it should be, referendum should be more on neutrality status and security guarantees deal. It's worth mentioning that that neutrality idea, as all of you know and many people know, itself is quite discredited in Ukraine, since Ukraine was attacked by Russia in 2014, when it was officially, according to the legislation, non-aligned or neutral. That's why, you know, it would be not easy to sell neutrality idea at that point. And that's why many people perceived the Zelensky team move to give up on potential NATO membership as beginning of Ukraine's capitulation, not as like a sophisticated diplomatic maneuver, for example, which could be. I can't exclude that. I even can't exclude that without that offer from Ukraine, Russia even didn't start negotiations with the Ukrainian side, you know. And I also can't exclude that it's still possible to sell the idea of neutrality at the referendum, but only if Ukraine manages to get real security guarantees from a number of NATO member states, primarily from the United States.
Okay, thank you.
But we don't see much appetite from the US and some other NATO member states to provide the security guarantees similar to NATO Article 5, which is crucial.
Okay, thank you. We've got only 7 minutes left. We have a bunch of audience questions. Please limit your answers to a minute or less. We have a question from Bob O'Connell. I think it's for Alexander. He's curious about the anti-ship missiles. Are they in fact harpoons, or are they other anti-ship missiles? And who provided them? So Alexander, can you take that on?
United Kingdom.
United Kingdom.
Currently already in Odessa, yeah.
And they are harpoons, is that correct? Or are they something else?
That is correct.
Okay. All right, good. We've had a couple of questions from, let's see, Mark Zashin and Joe Morley Davies regarding possible use of chemical weapons. Is this still a possibility? General Keith, what do you think?
Sure, but I don't think it'll happen. But it's always a possibility. They have them in their arsenal, they could use them. If they do, they change the game completely.
What do you think, Keith, if in fact they use them, what would be the likely response from the US and NATO?
I can't predict. We've been pretty bad in predicting all along on this thing. So I don't know, but I don't think we would, quote, respond in kind. But I honestly don't know, John.
Okay, fair answer. All right. Question from James Duran, which I think is for you, Vlad. And I think you may have partly answered it, but I'll give you a chance again. Can this war end with any solution that leaves Putin in power? Or is his departure a requirement for change?
Well, first, on the chemical weapons, if you allow me, I think that is a possibility because that fits into Putin's tactic on sowing terror among Ukrainians, Ukrainian military, Ukrainian population. If his previous measures, bombings and killing of civilians at the occupied territory, if this doesn't work, to his opinion, he can proceed further as we saw in Syria. So I think there should be a very realistic discussion in the West about the response, because we already passed beyond some points where the response should have been much more serious, but we're not clearly seeing it. So that will be, another super red line. We should get prepared for it. And now on Putin staying in power, it's a difficult thing to analyze potential changes in the Russian government, because for over 20 years, Putin's been specifically building a system where he's super guarded against any political changes. So we don't know how these changes might take place. But what we do know is that the current situation delivers the major blow to structural integrity of Putin's system since the beginning of his rule. His bureaucrats have no idea how to proceed further, being disconnected from the rest of the world financially, economically, technology-wise. So we need to double down on efforts. I don't have any specific scenario. And I also really believe that once Putin is not removed from power, then we will have the same situation as we face today, repeating back again and again, maybe unfortunately on a bigger, more scary scale.
Okay, thank you. We have a question, let's see, regarding support in the East for the Russians from Irving Plotkin. Does Russia have any real support by the population in the Russian occupied territories? This would be for you, Alyona.
Actually, I don't know. I don't know what is the situation now. I know that there were some opinion polls in Russian occupied territories, maybe not recently, but a couple of years ago. As far as I heard and I read, many people and majority of people still supported being part of Ukraine. They supported the idea of being part of Ukraine, not being part of Russia. They had and maybe still have different vision how Ukraine should develop, but still they voted for Ukraine as the place where, or a country and the state where they would like to live.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Leo Trick, and excuse me if I mispronounce your name, Junior. It is encouraging to see that many young people in Russia are the ones opposed to Putin's war, although their protests have been pretty much shut down. Do you feel that Russia's youth, with their command of social media and by other means, have the ability to help change the views of those being misled by Mr. Putin? I think that's for you, Vlad.
Yeah, and it's very clear, and like all Russia polling data, however cautiously we might treat it, suggests that there's an abyss between the views of Russian youth and elderly people aged 55 and older, who are the backbone of support for Putin. Just, the very recent poll that was cited by Levada saying that 80% of Russians supporting the military operation, among Russian youth aged under 25, just a quarter says that they definitely support the operation, which is the lowest number among all the age groups. So youth, yeah, we're really very hopeful about the Russian youth.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. There's one more question, which is, what is the best site for news about Ukraine? And I will answer that by saying it's Ukraine Alert, of course, which we put out here at the Atlantic Council. With this, our hour is up. I'd like to thank very much our speakers for joining us. especially Alexander and Alyona from Ukraine. And I should mention that General Dayton is on the West Coast, so he got up early in the morning to join us to provide wonderful commentary. And of course, Vlad, it's always wonderful to hear from you. And I believe you're coming to us from Vilnius. So thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
And see you next week.